So good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I'm so excited to be here with all of you on our Zoom and to welcome Lauren Grodstein, who wrote our beautiful book that I hope you have all read. If you have not yet read it, I'm going to put the link to our Mitzvah Mall purchase in the chat, but before we begin with all of that, I want to say a huge thank you to the Jewish Book Council for making this possible. A huge thank you to our co-chairs of the Besters book programs, Ruth Seif and Barbara Sonnies. And a huge welcome to Lauren Grodstein, who's going to share with us about her book, We Must Not Think of Ourselves. But I hope that you've all had a chance to read We Must Not Think of Ourselves. And if not, you can make a chance to purchase it through our Mitzvah Mall, which supports WHC's social justice endeavors. And if you have any questions during our program, I'll ask you to direct message them to me, privately message them to me, so that we don't distract Lauren while she is presenting and sharing with us. And let me just, and that way I can keep track of everything as well. And welcome again to Lauren Grodstein, the author of 5 novels, including the Read with Jenna selection, We Must Not Think of Ourselves, the New York Times book bestseller, A Friend of the Family, and the Washington Post Book of the Year, The Explanation for Everything. Lauren's work has been translated into French and Turkish and German and Hebrew and several other languages. Her essays and reviews have been widely published, and she teaches in the MFA program at Rutgers University Camden, living in New Jersey with her husband and her children. And she has shared with me this morning that she unfortunately is quite under the weather, so she'll do the best that she can with what voice that she has. So please bear with us, and if you have any trouble hearing anything, let me sort of retype it into the chat. But thank you so much, and welcome to Lauren Grodstein.
And I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad we're on Zoom, so I am not contagious via computer. What I'm going to do is share my screen so that I can sort of take you through a little bit about this book. So the novel is set in the Warsaw Ghetto, and it tells a story of a group of archivists I knew nothing about before 2019. So this little slideshow I'm going to show you talks a bit about talks mostly about what the archive was and a little bit about how I bumped into it. And then I'd love to have a conversation. So any questions that you have about absolutely anything, I'm game to answer. So let me share my screen. I am almost certain to screw this up the first time, but let's see. Okay, can you guys see that? A picture of a very adorable family? Okay, so this is most of my extended family. There I am in the middle. There's my husband, my kids who are much younger then. That's one of the balloons I had to buy my daughter to keep her occupied. Every day she got a new huge balloon. Those are my parents. And this is all, this photo was taken outside the Sofitel in Warsaw, Poland. We were there because it was this adorable redhead's bar mitzvah. This was my nephew. And for his bar mitzvah, instead of having a big party, the kind that I'm sure many of your kids and grandkids had, and you yourselves had, with lots of people, my nephew's sort of an introvert, and the idea of having that much attention on him really freaked him out. So he and his parents instead decided that they wanted to do a family heritage trip. Both my mom here and my dad, both of their families came from Warsaw and the immediate environs. My dad's family came over in the 1920s, my mom's family in the 1880s and 90s. But of course, their great grandparents and great grandparents never said a word about their story. Like so many immigrants of the time, when they got here, they really wanted to put the past behind them and look toward building the future. So when my nephew wanted to find out more about his family, there was nowhere really to turn. We didn't have family stories or documents. So we were reliant on this guy in the sandals. He was our wonderful tour guide named Adam. And Adam took us on an incredible journey. We went to Krakow and saw the old Jewish quarter. We saw the Schindler factory. We went to a former shtetl called Schmielnik. Schmielnik is a fascinating place. It once been about 60% Jewish. During the Holocaust, the Jewish residents were exterminated in front of their neighbors' eyes. And in order to memorialize their neighbors, who had also been, in many cases, their trading partners, sometimes their friends, the non-Jewish citizens of Schmielnik rebuilt the synagogue. And in the middle of the synagogue is a glass bima. It's really beautiful. It might be one of a kind. We saw that, and all of my children, my nephews and nieces poured into the bima. It was a really nice sign of renewal. Of course, we also went to Auschwitz. We went to the Polin. If any of you have been to Warsaw, you've probably seen the most magnificent museum of Jewish Polish history. And at the end of the trip, everybody was exhausted. Remember, there were a lot of little kids with us. They'd been pretty good, but they required constant balloons to keep them occupied. And eventually they split off, and 4 people, my mother, my parents, and me, went to a place called the Jewish Historical Institute. I didn't know what it was. It had a pretty bland name. It was at 35 Damascus Street. So this is the street sign for this place. And once you get to 35 Damascus Street, you walk up the stairs and you see written on the wall in Yiddish, Polish, and English what we've been unable to shout out to the world, which is curious. I didn't know what that meant, but it was interesting. And next to this engraving was a big map of Poland, but it was Poland as it's been over the years. So there were diagrams cut into the boundaries showing all of the shifting borders of Poland and how some of Poland had been Lithuania, some of it had been Russia, some of it, Poland is not just one thing. Poland also before the war was a very multi-ethnic place. Now, when we think of Poland, at least when I think of Poland before this trip, I always thought of just a very monolithic Catholic country. But actually, before the war, Poland was 10% Jewish. There had been a 1,000-year history of Jews in Poland. It was also Ukrainian and Lithuanian and German and Russian. It was the war that turned Poland into one thing, but before it had been many things. Anyway, so we looked at this map, we looked at the sign, we walked up the stairs, and we saw this huge table, I don't know, at least 20, 25 feet long. And around the table were engraved these names. And underneath each name was a drawer. You can see the handle here. You pull out the drawer and you find out about the person whose name is engraved. And in this case, this first person is Emanuel Ringelblum. Emanuel Ringelblum, it turned out, was an historian. He was trained in Switzerland. He knew not just about European history, but specifically Jewish European history. And he understood that when the signs went up all over Warsaw in 1940, they also went up in other cities around Poland, saying that the Jews carried disease and that for the health and safety of the Slavic and Aryan populations, the Jews had to move into the old historically Jewish center of the city. And all of the non-Jews who lived in that part of town had to leave. He knew that something very momentous was happening. You have to remember, lots of people have said to me over the year or so that I've been talking about this book, people have asked me why the Jews stayed. And it's pretty self-evident to me that the Jews stayed because not only was this where their home was, most of them didn't have a place to go, but because they'd been through a lot in their 1,000-year history. There had been mostly, it had been a pretty good place for Jews, but there had been pogroms. There had been forced relocations. So many of the Jews this time thought, well, we've been through this before, we'll get through this again, and then our lives will continue. But Ringelblum knew otherwise. And when the gates were locked to what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto at 2 p.m. November 2nd, 1940, he instantly understood that this could be the very last moment of the Jewish-Polish story. So he gathered 60 that we know of. There might have been more intellectuals, writers, artists, rabbis. And he gave them white notebooks. And he told them to write it down, write everything down, write down everything you see. The Nazis have taken our homes. In some cases, they've taken our loved ones. They've taken our jobs. They've taken our dignity, but they will not take the truth. The truth belongs to us, and we will write it down. And so for the next almost 3 years, 2.5 years, until the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, that is what they did. They wrote down everything. And then in 1942, at the beginning of the Gross Action, which is when 6,000 people a day were taken from the ghetto to Treblinka. And then again, at the beginning of the uprising, just before the beginning of the uprising, they buried everything they wrote down in the ground and waited for it to be discovered. Of the 60, 3 people survived: a husband and a wife named Hirsch and Bluma Wasser, and a woman named Rachel Auerbach. After the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the Nazis completely destroyed what had been the ghetto. They bulldozed it to the ground. But somehow, without landmarks or GPS or anything, excuse me, these 3 were able to dig it up. And now this treasure is on display at 35 Damascus Street. And so after you pass this huge table with all these names, you walk up another flight of stairs and you see this. This is one of the milk cans that was buried under the ground. There are 3 of them. One is in Washington, D.C. at the Holocaust Museum. One is here in Warsaw. And one is still buried somewhere under the ghetto. They say under the Chinese embassy. Nobody knows. Within these milk cans were documents like this one. This is a diary entry from someone named Israel Lichtenstein. I can't read Yiddish, so I don't know what it says. But I know, having read lots of the archive, that what they reported on was mostly, well, was all sorts of things. Everything from religious observances, there were religious observances in the ghetto, to reviews of the Shakespeare Company, to complaints about the food, to laments about what had happened to them, to philosophical debates about why this was happening to them. The archive, as it stands, does not read like a novel or an encyclopedia, but rather like a huge, almost collage of what life looked like. So it really contains everything. I'm going to put myself on mute for 1 second. Excuse me. I can't find the mute button, so just don't listen for 1 second. This is a drawing of a girl named Margot Lichtenstein. Her mother, Gila, Margot Sextain. Her mother, Gila, was a watercolor artist. She wrote of her daughter, who was 2 years old when she was killed, that she hoped the world remembered that she had a beautiful daughter who was talented. This is one of the stars that the Jews in the ghetto had to wear around their arm. Many Jews commented that of all of the degradations, somehow wearing the star was the worst, because it signaled to the outside world that you were somehow not to be treated as human. When the guards or anyone, a passing non-Jew, saw the star on your arm, was a sign that they could take any of your belongings, beat you, rape you, kill you without punishment. And so it was even within the ghetto, it was a further mark sort of the dehumanization of this population. This is a picture of the soup kitchen. The Nazis only allowed about 200 calories a day, a little bit under. Obviously, you can't survive on that. So soup kitchens, which provided about 700 calories a day, were started in the ghetto with the help of something called the Judenrat, which was the Jewish council. These soup kitchens were also a place of real philosophical debate, right? If you see someone close to death, who's not going to survive clearly the day, and there's a pregnant woman behind him, do you give him his 7 calories? Do you give her his 7 calories? Do you give a child 7 calories? Do you give a man who needs more calories than a woman? Do you need a woman because she's doing the hard work of raising children more calories? There was lots written about these soup kitchens, and they became these, again, centers of sort of moral debate about life and death and who shall live and who shall die in ways that are really excruciating to read. At the end of the exhibit, you come across this, which is the Ringelblum archive translated into Polish and, thank goodness, in English. At the end of our visit, I was able to sit and just start reading through the archive. I found it fascinating. I couldn't believe I'd never heard of this. I couldn't believe that this treasure was there. It serves as the largest first person collection of person documents written by Jews during the Holocaust. I had no idea there was anything like this out there. This is a picture of Warsaw after the war. You can see this is old Warsaw, and you can see it was totally, thoroughly destroyed. These buildings are sort of standing. Most buildings were not. This is the same corner now. Old Warsaw was rebuilt brick by brick, starting as soon as the war was over, even though people were still starving. But they did this as a way, the Polish people did this, rebuilt this beautiful part of their city as a way to start slowly reclaim their dignity. And now when you go there, it's a good place to drink a beer, eat pierogies, listen to street musicians, get your cartoon, your caricature drawn. It's a touristy and fun place to be. So just like that rebirth, this rebirth on a much smaller scale is one that I like to sort of end this brief slideshow on, because it's a picture of Jewish joy. This is my nephew. This was his bar mitzvah celebration. It was at the JCC in Krakow, which is a remarkable place that would be familiar to you, I'm sure, because it does all the things a JCC does. You can leave your kids there for daycare. You can celebrate Shabbat or holidays there. You can work out and you can have a party. And so at my nephew's bar mitzvah, he said some prayers. We danced in circles and we had a real moment of Jewish joy in a country that had seen so much Jewish joy for 1,000 years and then so much Jewish heartache after. It was a really, really, really wonderful time. People have asked me how I feel about Poland, because Poland is, of course, the location of the most horrific crimes against Jews, some of the most horrific crimes against Jews of the 20th century, and is known for, of course, some of the anti-Semitic pogroms that happened after the war, when Jews would try to go home and Polish people who'd taken over their homes would violently kick them out and sometimes kill them. And this is what I have to say about that. Poland is a complicated place, as every place on this planet is. But the people who keep Jewish memory alive in Poland right now are not Jewish for the most part, because there are very few Jews really left in Poland. They're people who remember their Jewish neighbors. They're people who live among the Jewish ghosts that populate Poland. And they are people who welcomed us back to show us a part of our history that we didn't know. So I actually am very fond of Poland, and I'm really happy that my nephew celebrated his bar mitzvah there. We had a really great time. Anyway, this was all 2019. I came home from this trip thinking a lot about the archive, but never thinking I would write a novel about it, because that's just not my thing. I don't write historic fiction. I certainly never wanted to write a book about the Holocaust. I felt that if Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel had done it, it was not for me. But anyway, forgive me, I'm so sorry. After the pandemic started, and for the first time, people were dying outside and the world was scary in a new way. And also I was trapped at home. All the rules about what you could or couldn't write or couldn't do suddenly seemed to go out the window. I just sort of didn't care about what was it, I don't know, what I had done before. I felt like, well, the world is upside down anyway, and I need a project. I need to do something to stay sane. And clearly, like my sourdough bread isn't going to cut it. So I decided, I'll just try this book. I'll try to write this story that's been percolating since I went to Poland, and I'll see if I can do it. And over 8 months, when I wasn't homeschooling or, walking the dogs endlessly, I walked the dogs so much during the pandemic. I wrote this book. Came out in November of last year, about a month and a half after October 7th. It's been a really interesting time to be on the road talking about the Holocaust and specifically the ghetto experience. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about any of it. And again, I apologize. Usually I can talk for longer and with more vigor. But I thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And let me unshare now. Okay. So
I'm going to go ahead and start us off, if I may, unless Ruth, I saw you moving around. Did you unmute yourself to ask something?
Okay. All right. I just wanted to say, I mean, I've read the book and it was, it was very moving. But I'm glad to hear how you came about writing it. I mean, that was really interesting that your family went to Poland for your nephew's bar mitzvah,
yeah,
and how you got to that museum. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it just is amazing. And that's, I didn't know anything about that after reading the book. So that just adds more to it. And absolutely, places it even more in historical fiction. So just thank you for sharing that. That's an
Well,
amazing story.
it's a pleasure. I think one of the reasons we don't know about it, frankly, is because it was dug up in Poland, right? And because and Poland during communism. And so there just wasn't the same attention paid to the horrors of the Holocaust behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet ideology or communist ideology said that the only real victims of the Nazis were the communists. So there just wasn't the same kind of publicity paid to this little museum. And I've been there now 3 times, and there's never more than 5 people in there when I go.
Mm.
It's wild. I know. But I don't want to make it out, by the way, that I'm the only, I mean, it's been written about, there's scholarly texts about it, there's a I mean, people know about it, but not nearly as many as you'd think would.
So one thing that always, if I may,
Yeah.
one thing that stood out to me is, I'd read about the Oneg Shabbat collective in the past. I'd learned about it in cantorial school, you study a certain certain amount of these things, especially what leads up to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising during the year in Israel and da 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 da. And Oneg Shabbat literally means the joy of Shabbat, which I think was such a beautiful name for this group to choose as they were like combating all of this hate, right? And combating all of this just fear and unknown.
Yes.
And so I'm curious, as you read those archives, did you see where did that joy come in? I feel like there were real moments of joy in here scattered through across that, and you talked about your own family's experience with this moment of Jewish joy for your nephew's bar mitzvah. And so I'm curious how that thread has carried through sort of in your experience of learning about this and then in your experience of writing this novel.
So even in, there was a Passover Seder with matzah somehow in the ghetto a few weeks before the uprising. I don't know how they got the matzah. And I don't want to say that it was a joyous Seder necessarily, but the story of the Exodus is a story of triumph, right? So there were moments there, and there were weddings, and there were brisses, and there were bar mitzvahs in the ghetto. So obviously there were moments of true celebration, even within this sort of prison. I also think that for better, I guess, although it's sad that it has to be this way, is the Jewish spirit is resilient, and that people, all people, not just Jewish people, not all people, but many of us look for joy wherever we can find it as a way of getting through the day. I certainly do. So I found in writing this book, which was such a serious book to write and somber, that any place where I could insert a little joke or a laugh or a smile for my characters felt true to what they might have experienced, and certainly true to what I needed to write, if that makes sense, to write a book like this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Also, Jews are funny, don't you think? Like often. So I like, my, I love like some dark humor, or I don't know, a dirty joke or anything. So I wanted my characters to have that too.
And I think that's really true. I think a big piece of Jewish resilience has been dark humor, right? That
For
like, well,
sure.
we've been through worse before, so let's,
Absolutely. Yeah,
survive this one too, and we're gonna find a way to laugh about it.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, I'm also curious how much of what you read in those archives um, inspired the characters of your novel. Um, you've got this really rich tapestry, and I wonder how many of them, those little bios that Adam writes, are any of them, sort of inspired directly from a little bio that someone that you read, or was Adam himself inspired by a bio that you read, or how did that?
So all of the names, first of all, are real names. So not first and last names, but all the last names come from victims, and all the first names come from people in the archive. So that was my first way of my own small way of trying to honor them, was just by bringing their names back. Uh, um, Nobody was taken directly from the archive, but lots of small details were. One of the characters um, is a fishmonger's daughter. That came from somewhere. The story of the kid getting kicked off his soccer team after the Nazis invaded, that's from something real, right? So small details helped me sort of imagine what their worlds were like. But I never did a one-to-one kind of, here's someone from the archive. There were a couple of real people who made appearances. Gilles Sextain, the artist, is in the book. Emanuel Ringelblum is in the first scene. And I mentioned like Vladislav Spilman, who was the pianist. But for the most part, people are very, very inspired by what really happened, but not real themselves. The story of Shifra, who's this beautiful girl who tried to secure her brother's freedom by sexual engagement with the Nazis. Her story is very real and comes from many, many women who sometimes successfully, often not, used all they had, which were their bodies, to try to secure safety or freedom for people they loved. So yeah, so I mean, the archive shaped the book, but wasn't a one-to-one sort of equivalence. The characters weren't an equivalent. The other thing that 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 really helped me were photographs. So not just the archive itself, but the Nazis were demented about recording everything. So there were photographs in the ghetto, and also there were some secret Jewish photographs in the ghetto. And looking at those images really helped me envision what a place would be like. I don't usually rely on photographs, but because what was there is no longer there, I found it incredibly helpful.
Another thing that sort of jumped out to me in reading this, and now hearing you talk about your process for sort of finding your way to this story, is I'm wondering what is your writing process usually like, and how different was it, or was it at all, when you were writing this book?
Yeah, that's a great question, and totally different. So my writing process often is, this is my office, that little couch right there. For some reason, I do work like thinking work, bill paying work here at this desk, and I do writing work sitting up on that couch. I can't explain why, but once I'm on the couch, it's usually like it's quiet for long stretches of time. If I'm not at school, I teach, but if I'm not in school that day and my kids are at school, then I usually have like 6 or 7 hours of quiet, which is such a blessing. Oh my goodness. Uh, it's a blessing I really, really think about when my kids are home, and I write, and I can research, I can go online and answer any sort of silly questions I have, and it's joyful for me because I like to do it. During the pandemic, it was not like that at all. During the pandemic, everybody was around all the time. There was no quiet. And I was just trying to steal 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to work.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing was that I was hanging this book on a historical scaffold. So I really needed to continually double check and triple check my timing, making sure I had everything right. I cared a lot about not screwing up, even though of course I did. and people wrote to me to tell me all the things that I messed up. But I taped to my desk bullet points like major events of World War II and major events of the ghetto. It was quite interesting to see how they lined up, right? A lot of like the US didn't even enter the war until the ghetto had been around for over a year. And D-Day happened, but which seemed very triumphant, you know, for on the Western Front. But horrific things were still happening, and real defeat seemed like it was happening in Asia. So it was really an interesting thing to try to line up my American experience of the war versus what was happening in Europe and Poland.
If I may, I am not in my office. I'm in the garage.
Okay.
My housekeeper is vacuuming and I can't hear. I wanted, first of all, to say I loved your book. It was fabulous. It
Thank
was
you.
just wonderful. I read it as soon as it came out. And I also wanted to share that several years ago, maybe 2015, I was in Warsaw. I went to the museum that you are talking about. And I was in front of the Warsaw Museum. This is the big museum. There is a plaque in the ground, and it says, on this day, this is the site where the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto committed suicide. And it just happened to be the day I was born.
Oh, wow.
And I was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's amazing that none of this was long ago, right? It wasn't that long ago. It's interesting because I have kids. My children are 16 and 9. And to them, World War II is ancient history. I mean, they know, I guess, that my grandfather served, but they doesn't really seem like anything that they could touch, even though they were both in Poland. But to me, it feels as close as yesterday, really.
Well, the story about the milk cans just blew me away.
Yeah, is that wild? It's an amazing thing.
Margaret, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you, Lauren, for this presentation and for your book.
Sorry again that I sound like this. I don't, yeah.
Oh no, you sound great. It's probably harder for you to go through that though. My mother was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, the only survivor of her family.
Yeah.
She was actually saved by a German who got her out. But I remember she had a capacity to enjoy life, even though, you know, she had there was definitely a strong moodiness there and depression, but she was still very successful and could enjoy things. So when you talk about having some joy, I don't know that she felt joy in the Warsaw Ghetto, but she was able to maintain that in her life, which is fairly amazing because you think of people who went through maybe trauma that wasn't as severe and, you know, could lose that ability to do that.
Sure.
But I was at a concert recently, and there was a cello that had been buried. It was saved by people in the Warsaw Ghetto and put into a grave and retrieved. And it was, you know, used at this concert. Commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto recently. It was so powerful. I think the highs and the lows on the cello were more dramatic than with, you know, maybe a different instrument, as what the musician had said. But I did put my contact information in the chat, and I'd to you, Lauren, and I would welcome the opportunity to connect with you and anybody else who, I do have some memoirs that my mother wrote that I feel an obligation to do something with at some point. So in case anybody has any ideas, I'm gonna put my contact info in the chat. Thank you.
How old was she when she was in the ghetto?
I think she was like 14 when the
Oh,
war
wow.
started and like 17. Yeah, when she lost her whole family. Her father was in the Polish military and he was killed at Katyn prior. But she had a little bit of an unusual story because she was one of the people who were selected out. You know, as people were driven to the trains, she was told, not you. So that was a mixed bag for her. I'm sure she had terrible guilt about being in that situation. At first, she wanted to die, but I think what made her want to live, she heard some relatives saying that she wouldn't make it, and hearing that made her want to live. She was one of those people where if you told her she couldn't do something, it made her determined to do it. I guess I got a little bit of that. But we do have there is a second generation group in our area, and I think they're all over for like children of Holocaust survivors. So I'd welcome the opportunity to talk more with you, Lauren, and I maybe arrange like a virtual program or something.
Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah,
Sharing that.
it's sort of a
It's an
thing.
incredible story.
Sorry.
It's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing it.
Well, her
Yeah.
story is incredible, but it's easy as a child not to want to deal with it. But I think, you know, there's an obligation.
Where did you grow up?
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, no, no.
I grew up in the just DC area in Bethesda.
Yeah.
I feel guilty too for not doing anything. So I hope the opportunity will come. But the trauma is definitely passed on, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
In different ways, you know. And there's a therapist, I think it's Feldson or something like that, who specializes in that topic. She does some amazing work. I don't know if there are any other children of survivors here. I guess not. But yeah, it is very interesting.
Yeah, I've met several. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in this process. Yeah.
I
It's
don't
a
know.
huge, huge, huge. I don't know what the right word is. It's a huge difference in your childhood and your understanding of the world when those are your parents' stories.
Yeah. They're
So,
all people have different traumas, and I guess we can't compare them. But I mean, that's the weird thing is like, you know, even if you're raised in like a loving home where your parents are doing their best, it still lingers in the background.
Of course it does. Of course it does. Margaret, I would love to connect with you offline sometime about where we might share some of what your mother wrote down.
Oh, great.
And if there's maybe a place for it in the WHC archives and things like that as well.
Thank you.
Of course, of course. And I see that Joan has a question. So
did you want me to go ahead?
please.
Okay, so last night I was at the Shakespeare Theater for the opening of some historical fiction about the Jewish experience. So I just wanted to mention to everybody in Washington that this play has just opened. It's called Leopoldstadt, and it's about.
I loved that play. I
You
saw
saw
it.
it
Yeah,
already.
it was
It's
wonderful.
just opening in Washington.
Yeah.
I'm going to see it
It,
in a couple of weeks.
it's about Jewish family over the generations and their experience in Vienna, starting in the early 1800s and ending with the Holocaust. So I just want to mention that there's that. It's very moving and very well done. And I have a question for our author, and that is about the name. I did see the 4 words in the text of the book, but I sort of wonder why were those 4 words chosen as the book, the name of the book, to give it, you know, what were the, I know usually the editors or the publishers choose names.
Yeah, you mean the
Do you
title?
have any sense what they were trying to convey with with those 4 words? We mustn't think of ourselves, maybe. at
Oh,
the
the title. Yeah, so you're right that often publishers will or editors, somebody, marketers, actually the title's a marketing decision. So often marketers will choose, the marketing department will choose your title. We must not think of ourselves was sort of the title that I put in just as a placeholder. I never expected them to keep it. When I put it in as a placeholder, I thought, well, it's sort of a nod to Shiva, right? During Shiva, we must not think of ourselves. We think of the mourners and of the deceased. We turn the mirrors around. We sit in uncomfortable chairs. It's also a line in the book, so I just thought, well, I'll use a line from the book that I think is sort of resonant, and then they'll change it to whatever they want. I was really surprised they kept it. But I think it works. My fear about it is that it's a little bit vague, right? Like there's a lot of pronouns in it, but it's, I don't get too worked up about titles because I've never gotten to keep my own. I do love the cover though. I think the cover is really beautiful.
I agree. It's gorgeous cover art. Really gorgeous. There was a question earlier, and I'm wondering, it was sent in the chat to me. But were you ever able to, as you were writing this during the pandemic and lockdown, I imagine you weren't able to go back to Poland to do more research there while you were writing it. Have you been back to Poland since you wrote the novel?
Yeah, I was able to go back during the editing process. So books take a long time to write, but in my case, they take longer to edit. So the book was in edits in April 2022, which is the first time I went back. I since went back also again in 23. I work at Rutgers and they were really generous. They gave me a grant to go back and keep researching. So I was there 2 months after the war started in Ukraine. And when I went, Warsaw was really, there was Ukrainian writing everywhere. I landed and immediately found myself next to a sort of a station for refugees. And then at the main Warsaw train station, there was a huge NATO tent set up for refugees. And a friend of mine in Warsaw, her office had been turned into a daycare center for women and their children. Obviously, men were not allowed to leave Ukraine. So there were kids playing, in her office floor and their moms working on their laptops. So it was a really interesting time to go back, and I found it really resonated with what the book was about, right? Like another madman has decided to start invading Europe after really telling the world what he was going to do. Nobody listened. And there was a lot of appeasement then and a lot of appeasement now. And, populations are again being displaced, atrocities are being committed. It felt pretentious to be back at that moment. And my neighbors were great. They knew I was going and they had a sense that I would bump into some Ukrainians in need. And so my neighbors collected about $1,000 and lots of toiletries. And we put together these Ziploc bags with some cash and toothbrushes and, socks and anything you might need on the road, and notes saying, using Google Translate, from your friends in America. And I was handing these out. And I said in the stupid way you do when you're just making conversation, you don't really think about it. I said to a woman, like, well, who could have thought this would happen? And she looked at me and she was very nice, but she said, well, anyone would have thought this would happen who was paying attention. Anybody would have thought this would happen. And I thought that really, it's like, right, of course, anybody. If you want to look, you'll see it. We just don't want to look.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Who wants to look for it?
Right. Why would you want to look? But there it is. Yeah.
Goodness. I am happy to ask more questions, but I also don't want to stand in the way of anyone in the group asking questions. So please feel free to speak up if you have them, or I will jump in with more. Well, then I'm going to go ahead. Oh, Margaret, please.
I mean, I think with the Germans, you can see that a lot of money was given. Like for my mother, she had access to help when she got old through funds. But I remember my mother really, she sort of had a resentment of the Poles because it was like being betrayed by your own. You know, somehow it felt deeper to her, I think, that resentment. And I was just curious, like, today in Poland, I mean, I think in Germany, my sense is, I don't know, but that this history is kind of remembered and there's like, you know, regrets about it. Is that the case in Poland, would you say?
I don't know. I don't know. I know that for some people it certainly is, and lots of people have uh done all sorts of work. Lots of people have found their own Jewish roots that they were never expecting to find. Jewish cemeteries are being rebuilt by non-Jews. The Jewish museums are staffed by non-Jews. So I would say, yes, there's certainly some Polish people who understand what happened on their soil, and even and some who understand their responsibility in it. But the Poles themselves lost an awful lot during the war. I think they feel like they themselves were victims, which they were, right? And are not that inclined to say that, you know, other people suffered necessarily more. So I think it's a mixed bag, honestly. Obviously, the people that I come in contact with and who work with me are very cognizant of the Holocaust, cognizant of what Jews lost, and by extension, what all of Poland lost. But I don't think that that's everybody. No.
My mother talked about the anti-Semitism that was around before the war. Like she went to a private Catholic school, and her father was in the Polish military. I think he sought to hide his Jewish identity in hopes that he would have more chance at being promoted if it wasn't known. But yeah, she did talk about that, about how, like, even her mother, who tutored kids at the school, people would say, you know, even though she was helping people, there would still be like nasty comments and stuff. Kind of interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, there were Jews and there were Poles. And even though the Jews had lived in Poland for, you know, centuries, they were not Poles, right? It's a very different way of thinking about citizenry and nationality and belonging. Here, you can become an American in, you know, half a decade, but in some places, and certainly in Poland, then you would never become a Pole. You didn't want to become a Pole. You were a Jew.
Although it's interesting also to read, you know, a lot of the narratives that you created and pulled together and borrowed from in this book, right? A lot of them were saying, well, right, we're not Poles per se, but we're Polish and this is our home, right? And so there's this interesting duality there of saying, you know, Adam talking about, well, yeah, his brother went to Israel, but why would he go? He doesn't have any reason to leave, right? This is his home, and this is where his family's been for 1,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I learned in writing this book was how much of a stayer I really am. You know, my husband's mom is from Canada, and we're sort of half-heartedly, you know, pursuing. He doesn't automatically get Canadian citizenship. It requires a lawyer and some work, and we'd have to do that work, and neither one of us has that much time or interest in bureaucracy. But mostly both of us are stayers, you know, like it would take a lot for us to uproot ourselves. And we like our lives, and we, you know, much like Adam, I share a lot in common with Adam. I like my life. I'm at home in my community. My kids, my daughter plays soccer, my son does jujitsu, they have friends, and, you know, I have friends in my work and my dogs and my life. It's so unfathomable. And I have so many more resources than theoretically somebody in 1939 Warsaw probably did, for the most part. You know, we could go somewhere. But the idea that of leaving our home and everything we've built here just seems impossible. So we've talked about, especially in writing this book and in recent days, like, well, what would it take for us to leave? How would we know it was time to leave? But like so many people in Poland, you don't know until it's too late. And I don't know that we would know. I don't know how you could. The people in Poland who didn't leave were living in a time before Auschwitz. They were living in a time before the concentration camps. They had no idea how bad it was going to get because it had never gotten that bad before. We might all be living in the before times. I have no idea. But I have a feeling, knowing myself, I'm not going to run, you know? I'm going to trust like that things will be okay in the end, and I hope they will. It's just the person that I am. It's the person a lot of people are, it turns out.
Right. We, I mean, I always think about, you know, my own ancestors, my great-grandparents, all four of them on my mom's side were immigrants as children and teenagers.
Yeah.
Some of them came over with their parents. Some of them came over before the rest of their family and saved up to bring their families over. And they all came, you know, after the 1905 pogroms. And you think about the courage that it takes to go, but also the courage, I mean, it's just staying just feels natural, right? When you have a home. And one of the things that I always think about is, how bad does it have to get? How uncomfortable do you have to be in your home to make it worth leaving?
Right.
Right.
For a lot of people, really, really uncomfortable. Because most people.
Right.
Most
Right. Okay, so we are almost out of time. But I want to open it up for if anyone has one last question before we wrap up. And I know I want to leave a minute or two for Ruth to share a few announcements about programming for the Besters. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lauren.
It was a pleasure. I'm going to go make some more tea. Thank you guys for putting up with my voice. It was a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You take care.